Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome. We're at an interesting point in the history of ship movement on the west coast of British Columbia and the amount of ship traffic around the world. When it comes to our safety record and how much is going on, how well are we doing here in relationship to the rest of Canada and maybe other jurisdictions?
Well, I think statistics speak for themselves, really. Recent reports have said that while not flawless, we're doing really well. In fact, we have a safety record that is amongst the best in the world.
The best in the world.
And certainly the best in Canada. So we're doing something right here on the West Coast, and I think it's important to figure out what we're doing right and why it's working so well.
Well, so what are some of those elements? What ensures that we are having very few accidents?
I think one of the big pieces of our safety framework is the culture of the industry itself. And that's driven by the culture of the coast, I think, in many respects. So those people that are involved in the safety framework take it seriously. They understand the implications of doing their job well. They understand the implications if they're not doing their job well. And so there's a real strong human element to our safety record. And then we've just got some very world-class safety framework that involve the pilotage regime that guides ships in and out of our harbors and our coasts, traffic control systems that are working very well, and traffic management schemes to bring that traffic in and out of what is a very important ecosystem to Canadians.
How important is the pilotage authority and the role that it plays in ensuring that when we're in coastal waters, these big ships arrive at their destination safely?
The authority is a critical piece of that framework because it links the user of that service, the service of pilots, to the actual people that are delivering the service, which is the pilots on every vessel that goes in and out of our ports in British Columbia. So they're enforcing regulations that the government has established through legislation, and they're also developing best practices with the industry and the pilots. So they play a critical role in that framework.
When a ship comes in, they can't come in without a pilot on board over a specific tonnage. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there are some other rare exceptions to that rule when it's a domestic movement or a movement between two places in British Columbia for certain types of traffic.
For those who are familiar with the waters and specific tonnage and so on.
That's right. Yeah. And they're given exemptions because of their experience level and their training. So every ship that you and I or the public sees that's passing through the Strait of Juan de Fuca or Harrow Strait or into the Strait of Georgia has a pilot on board.
How many?
At least one, and in some cases two. It really depends.
So what would be the considerations under which there would be two pilots on board?
Well, it depends on a few things. The duration of the transit itself. So there are, every transit isn't the same. The type of vessel that's being piloted. So for example, when you see a lot of the large oil tankers that go in and out of the port, those have two pilots on. So it really is dependent on the type of vessel and the risk that they're managing and the length of that transit.
Oh, okay. So when the risk goes up, you have more eyes and brains on the bridge.
It sounds simple. It's not, but yes, exactly that.
When a ship comes in, especially a large ship, what kind of liability insurance do they have to bring with them? So that in the event that something goes wrong, I guess the Canadian taxpayer doesn't get stuck with the bill.
Well, it's a liability system that is layered, and it starts with funds in Canada that have been paid in for and continue to get paid into by the users of the system. And then there are international liabilities that come into play when something demands even more funds to deal with some sort of mitigation from an accident. So it is a global system with a unique Canadian component to it as well.
So we had the situation where there was bunker sea oil that was exited the ship and wound up in English Bay a couple of years ago. Who ultimately pays for that? Like, do we pick up the bill as the taxpayers in Canada, or does that eventually get covered by that insurance policy?
That comes out of the insurance policies, and of course every carrier is also insured as well through their own protection and indemnity insurance globally. So no, that is not paid by the taxpayer.
When we look at the spill response protocols and the way in which it was handled in English Bay, of course it brought up big issues around the Coast Guard station in Kitsilano. Would it have made any difference if that Coast Guard station was open?
Well, difficult to speculate.
Yeah.
In the past, I think the reopening of the Kitsilano Coast Guard station provides some instant capability, which is good. But I think a lot of the delays that were caused in the response to that incident were based on procedural ones and not necessarily presence per se. So it was a good. Well, there's nothing good about a spill, but it was good an opportunity to see where we can improve the framework for spill response.
So what are some of the changes that have taken place post that incident?
Well, I think the opening of the Kitsilano Coast Guard base is a quick one,
Yeah.
obviously. But I think area response planning is probably the biggest change that's happening. So now the Coast Guard and Transport Canada are doing a pilot project for area response planning that's going to involve all the stakeholders in specific small areas to develop spill response plans. And this is definitely the positive way to go. And I think it will concentrate first on our trade corridors and then much broadly in the Canadian waters.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking, okay, I know that Port Metro is a very complicated port. I've heard that it is one of the most challenging for shippers to come into because there's so many local jurisdictions along with the Port Authority that come into play. Does that also come into play when it comes to emergency response? The fact that there are so many different jurisdictions, you know, in English Bay we're off the city of Vancouver, but you go down to Delta Port, well now we're looking at different jurisdictions. And
It's a very important dialogue that's happening with the port, its municipalities that border the port, the users of the port, and first responders. And if you can imagine the number of items that could flow through the Port of Vancouver, or any other port for that matter, if you're a first responder and you're dealing with some sort of incident, you need to know quickly what you're dealing with. So is that framework perfect? No. Are there a lot of people trying to make it better? Yes. And there's a lot of federal government leadership happening within hazardous and noxious substances, which is a convention that Canada has ratified and intends to sign on to a further protocol that will ensure that that first responder that's responding to some sort of incident where cargo is a concern knows what they're getting into. And it is important. And you can imagine there's a lot of municipalities that care about this.
just got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
I'd like to go back and just deal with a couple other little issues around pilots that I'm, not certain that I fully understand. Who exactly are these people and what's their level of experience that they have to have as a minimum to be able to do that job?
Off the top of my head, I can't quote the actual minimum, but they've all been captains of ships. They're master mariners. They've gone through not only a level of training themselves within their own careers, but they've also joined the authority to go through an apprenticeship program with very, very intensive training involving every type of situation that you could imagine with a ship. So on a day like today, when the sun is shining and there's no wind, the risk is low. Mm-hmm. But we don't train for a perfect day in the Port of Vancouver. We train for that day where the ship loses power unexpectedly and you've got to maneuver a large ship with just tugs and the skills and experience that those people have gained over a long time. So it really is an incredible responsibility. And of course, it doesn't happen just on a single ship. Those pilots need to understand the entire network of vessel movements that's happening on the course of their route coming in or out of BC waters. So it's a pretty big training in order to have that kind of experience.
Well, and they have to have a fairly intimate knowledge of every single part of the coast, don't they? Or the areas in which they're working anyways.
Well, we train in British Columbia pilots for the entire region. So they understand the depths, the bottom contours of everywhere that they could take that vessel. They understand the currents, how those currents change, the effects of the environment on that type of vessel, which can be quite different. You know, a large car carrier that's empty, I think you've seen them, it looks like a large apartment building on its side sailing through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, handles very differently than a bulker full of grain. So they have to get all of that experience in order to do their job properly.
And is it the same across Canada, or do we sort of operate to a different standard here on the West Coast?
It's not a different standard, but there are unique aspects of operating in Western Canada as opposed to other places in Canada. But the standard is the same. There are some uniquenesses within the relationship in the industry with the authority and also the pilots themselves.
So, as our links with Asia continue to expand, and we see tremendous effort underway through HQ Vancouver, from Advantage BC, and others to solidify those connections, bring head offices here, we're going to see more and more traffic on the West Coast. Are we in a position where we can, expand the resources that we need to meet that demand? How do we do that?
Are we in a position? Yes. But it's about connecting the dots, and the supply chain is very, very complex in Canada. And it's important that we, number one, acknowledge that we do have trade corridors, and these are important to our economy in Canada and arguably in North America and globally. And once we've acknowledged that we have those trade corridors, we can put the right minds to making them as efficient as possible. And as you can imagine, in a major city such as Vancouver, that's incredibly complex.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
When you want to introduce something new into the mix, and if there's a general sort of level of understanding around how it all works by the average person in British Columbia or in Vancouver, how then do you introduce new ideas in a way that will allow for social license? Because it's a big part of moving forward.
It is. It's a huge part. And I think what we're hearing from stakeholders in general is that some of these processes are too quick. And as you quite rightly point out, they're so complex. I'd argue even experts find it very difficult to understand all the intricacies of it. So how to get all of that information out to people so that they can understand the policy decisions that are facing decision makers is really the goal. And I think the Port of Vancouver is doing a good effort at that. And I think as a community, and I say that largely even outside of the transportation industry, we have to do better because people are demanding that we do better and that transparency is there.
Mixed into all of that, you have a bunch of other agendas from local governments, federal, provincial, NGOs, concerned citizens. Some will be putting out misinformation. How do you deal with that in a way that is going to ensure the general public that the next step forward is going to be a safe one? And I know that that's like saying, how do you untangle a ball of string? It's not easy.
Well, I think you have to go to the source sometimes. I think it's very important, and misinformation can often develop because people don't have the right information. So it's easy to turn to something that's available, and we have to guard against that. We as people that care about our cities, our coastlines, our industries. So trying to talk to people directly, I think, is important. That's how you build up relationships, and that takes time. And I see some positive things happening. It's easy to be negative, but I see some positive things happening because the solutions can't happen in isolation. So you can hear a certain constituency base upset with something. really, to find a solution, they're going to need multiple stakeholders to help them find that solution. So it's best to go to the source and ask why they feel the way they feel. So that takes time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of people involved in, I won't call it consultation, but just education and awareness. And that is a big part of what we're doing at the Chamber of Shipping. It's a big part of what the ports do regularly. And now we're starting to have that dialogue. And there's a lot of constituents. It's not the same as it was a decade ago. There's a lot more access to information, awareness of what's going on. So it's important that we get out to a lot of different stakeholders.
Like a lot of different stakeholders.
A lot of different stakeholders.
So, I've been out on ships. I've been in a wide variety of jurisdictions, and I see the culture of excellence that exists in that environment. And I look at it and I go, yep, when everything goes right, it is perfect. But every now and then, the human element comes in. And I think that this is the thing that scares people. I mean, all we have to do is point to the coal port in Delta a couple of years ago. There it is coming into dock and there's an incident. Luckily nobody was hurt and there was minimal damage, but we've got that human element. And I think that that's what scares people. And how do we help to address that in a way that says, even with human beings, we're doing everything we can to mitigate the potential risk?
Well, you have to be honest and open with people, first of all.
Yeah.
So there's no getting around the fact that accidents do happen. And despite the fact you put as many mitigation measures in place, it's likely somewhere, some point, an accident will happen. But we're getting a lot better of it. And as you referred to what you described as a culture of excellence, unfortunately that probably came from some very big incidents in the past and that drove change, drastic change. So now you'll find, the maritime sector that moves bulk liquids, whether it's oil, gas, refined or not, it is probably the safest culture that we have in our industry. It had to get there because it had some drastic accidents. But we have to be frank about what risk looks like. And often risk is associated with other elements, and those elements we are getting better at identifying. So I'll give you an example. We can now tell weather and forecast weather much more than we ever could before, days in advance. So when we're dealing with higher risk movements, we can take that into account. We can let people know and we can avoid it. We can avoid dense traffic situations. We have the capacity to control that. So these are the conversations in the marine shipping area that we need to continue to provide people the confidence and transparency that we can handle that risk, whatever that risk might be.
Our final break, and then we'll get to the exciting conclusion. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Okay, so now add in oil, and everybody points to the Exxon Valdez up the coast here, which is 30 some odd years ago, as being, oh, well, that's what we want to avoid. But what's happened in the industry to ensure that the Exxon Valdez never happens again? And has it ever happened since then?
Well, there hasn't been a spill of that magnitude, thank goodness.
Because we learned from the Valdez experience.
Yeah, and there's no question that was a horrific incident that drove incredible change in the industry that moves bulk liquids. What's changed? Well, there's been regulatory change that was drastic. Construction standards of ships changed. I think it's very well known now that there is no tanker that moves without having a double hull. And literally one hull that holds the cargo and another one that is just literally holding the rest of the ship there, so that there's a less risk of penetration of the hull into where the cargo sits. And then the standards in which that subsector of the industry is regulated has changed dramatically.
So if we look at the Valdez, it was not a tethered ship.
No, it was not.
And since
Single
then,
hull, untethered.
Single hull, untethered, Was there even a pilot on board, or was it just the
I
captain?
don't know off the
yeah,
top
I
of
don't
my
know
head.
that either. But
navigation equipment has changed dramatically. We now have real-time information and electronic charting that is demanded by regulation and world class. So it is a very different industry than it was 30 years ago.
how important is the tethering of those ships to these very powerful tugs as far as a safety step that's been put in place?
Well, tethering can be a good thing, and it can actually be a hindrance sometimes. So I'd hate to say it's the be-all and end-all of escorting ships. There are times when having a tug just nearby is a significant assistance. And it really depends on the situation. I think if you're inferring the dialogue around potential oil and gas projects in the region, where some of the proponents have suggested that they're prepared to have tethered and or tug escort for the duration of their transit in confined waters, that's a significant risk mitigation. And other parts of the world probably wouldn't even have it. So it's very, very significant.
Yeah, but
It literally is like having another ship to control your larger vessel. So
well, I've been
capability.
on one of the tugs that was tethered to super tankers in Norway, and you watch the role that they play. They're like, the lines are always taut. They're ever engaged and ready to deal with it until the ship is now out into open waters. And when you look at it, it makes sense. The ship's not moving that fast as it's leaving port. And to have that other level of security is what gives me a certain amount of peace of mind that we can do this here in British Columbia as well. But people go, no, no, no.
Well, I'm not sure that people are saying no, no, no. I think for many, they think the industry can probably manage the risk. They're worried about impact. And you hear that often from people, right? It's not the actual movement of the ship, it's the impact of a spill. Trying to find out what is appropriate risk for, as you mentioned, a social license, I think is really front and center in that dialogue.
And so the question is, how do we convey to the average person that the risk is low? Because if we don't take the risk, then we reduce our access to markets, and
Absolutely.
that's the other risk.
Our Canadian competitivity.
Yeah.
So.
And shipping, as far as Canadian economy and our competitive place in the world, how important is it?
Oh, it's paramount. I mean, almost everything that's exported or imported globally moves on a ship. And globally, that's 90% of all goods. It's significant. In Canada alone, the number of communities that are accessed or supplied by shipping is quite significant and often forgotten about.
So it's important that we get it right.
It really is important that we get it right. And people have to have the confidence that we're getting it right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in and doing this.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Pleasure.